Today we are talking about the radical redesign of organisations and why that is necessary. Dr. Martin Brueckner, could you tell us a little bit from your perspective as to what you see as the main global drivers of change and how they are actually impacting on organisations in Australia today?
Well, that's a big question. In many ways, there are there's a whole number of reasons as to why change is necessary, because change is driving the need for change in many ways. Underlying much of that is a frustration with the current system, which we have long been warned about, and the social fallout of economic orthodoxy and neoliberal policy settings have since been measured. And what we're basically realizing that there's been a growing disconnect between economic and social needs. So there's a growing disjuncture between the logic of the market and societal needs and societal expectations, and a whole raft of social, political and environmental consequences that the system has brought about. And it's the combine of these changes that have ultimately led to the need to think actively about the requirements for organizational change. Firms have become very adept to working within the current system, but as we are becoming increasingly aware, the system is very slowly grinding to a halt. We had first murmurs, for instance, with the global financial crisis, the Asian crisis and so forth, which have basically given us warning shots, economically speaking, about the system becoming increasingly unstable. We've seen in the Syrian civil war, for instance, a growing interconnect between climate change and growing political instability, people displacement, all of which has social, political, and of course economic consequences, which firms also have to tackle. And on top of that, the way in which we've designed modes of production and consumption, we are seeing increasingly humanity approaching and crossing environmental thresholds, giving us a specter of long-term unsustainability. So it is in that context that we need to think about organizational redesign.
In the past, we've talked about some of the more positive initiatives that more progressive companies have taken to address some of the environmental and broader ecosystem concerns that come under this broader rubric of global drivers. Top of mind, is there a couple of companies that come to mind as maybe being more progressive on the spectrum?
Well, it is certainly true that in the business realm much has been done and much has been invested into reducing impacts as it relates to modes of production and processes within firms, product design and so forth. And much also has been done in improving industry-society relations in the CSR space. There are examples where firms have pursued very aggressively net reductions and zero harm goals in their firms. Various European firms, for instance, have followed down that path and have put that into their organizational performance metrics. But these companies are far and few in between. In many cases, we're talking about rather cosmetic changes to business conduct as it relates to improving society relations, or as it relates to reducing the harm potential or real harm of firm processes and their products. This is not to be too critical of what firms have genuinely tried to achieve. It's just in the global context of rapidly approaching environmental change, some of these measures are simply not far-reaching enough, and that we need to be looking at aggregate reductions in human impact on the biosphere, and measures thus far by and large have fallen short of that target. So in that sense, more needs to be done in terms of harmonizing in the way in which businesses work, and harmonizing their practices and their operations with environmental thresholds and also social thresholds, and that we're also finding that the way in which firms operate, that societal needs aren't met in the way in which employment is being provided, looking increasingly at precarious employment and contractualism, that the way in which commerce is designed, that we are driving an unsustainable level of overconsumption, which of course has resource implications. And much of that has been documented for the last 20, 30 years. What I'm saying is not new. It is, however, only slowly dawning on political decision makers and commercial decision makers that the current modus operandi is unsustainable, and in that sense that a rethink is required.
So, in your mind, I mean, obviously one of the big challenges has been translating from the drivers, the meta drivers, if you like, and the broader forces that are widely documented in the works of, say, Naomi Klein and other authors of sort of public intellectuals, if you like. How do we translate that abstract level into tangible design change? I mean, you've mentioned interface carpets, for instance, in the past as a good example of a kind of closed system approach to environmental production and recycling. Does that stand as an example of where things should be going, or is more required?
In many ways it does. I mean, what this particular company has done is largely finding an engineering solution to an environmental problem that's inherent in carpet production.
Yes.
What I think can be learned more broadly from an example such as that of Interface is that we're looking at a firm that has undergone a dramatic value reorientation. And I think this is, as a take-home message for commerce in general, it is about a reorientation of values. I was talking about design principles that compel companies to behave in certain ways. And I was naming economic orthodoxy and neoliberal policy settings as key drivers of that particular architecture in which firms operate today. So in many ways, we ought not to be surprised about social and environmental fallouts of corporate behavior. It is germane to the logic of the system. So if we want to change corporate behavior, in many ways, we have to change the logic of the system, and this is where value reorientation comes into play. If profit maximization is at the core of the corporate mandate and of the corporate charter, then firms will do, in compliance with the law, to do everything that will maximize returns to their shareholders, because they will feel legally obliged to do just that. If we are conceiving of firms as part of the solution of meta problems that you described earlier, and precisely those type of problems that authors like Chomsky, Stiglitz, Klein, and the various deglobalization critics out there have been voicing. If we take these calls seriously, what we would then need to do is basically change the corporate mandate and entertain corporate structures that ultimately compel firms to be part of the solution rather than the problem. And we've seen examples of that in the rise of social enterprises, for instance, in the rise of B corporations, which make it very much the raison d'etre of firms to act in a socially benign and environmentally responsible fashion, so that the corporate objective is one of doing good, and as opposed to doing good in an abstract market-mediated sense, where corporate success is measured in dollars and cents in the way in which wealth and employment is being generated, not to minimize the contribution that plays when it comes to societal well-being. There are limits to that, and I think we've reached those limits in the 1970s when a standard of living was being reached that was sufficient. And was well within environmental boundaries. The excesses we've seen since have enabled humanity to cross those boundaries, which in the long term we would only continue to do at our peril.
So one of the themes that's come through from yourself and from the other interviewees today is this notion of bringing it back to individual responsibility. And you used the term Anthropocene. What does that mean in terms of individual behaviour change and the sort of agency of human beings in the future of the planet?
I guess the notion of the Anthropocene highlights the kind of impact or the level of impact humanity is having on the planet, that we've become the largest driver of change on this planet, even in a geological sense. Translating that back to the individual is about making connections between individual choices and individual actions to the larger consequences these actions have locally, regionally, but also globally. So in that sense, it's a call for responsible citizenship for individual firms and people within firms. It's about thinking about the kind of impact the firm has on society and on the planet. It is about entertaining a holistic outlook on not just the immediate task environment of people within firms, but of the broader social and natural environment in which firms are operating. I was talking earlier about the need for harmonization. This is precisely what it is about. So it is a matter of becoming both ecologically but also socially literate when it comes to the managing and running of firms. And this should then find translation in the kind of products and services that are being produced and rendered.
I like that idea of social literacy. I've recently been studying the work of Otto Scharmer, your countryman, and he talks about dealing with increasing social complexity and the sort of limits on that core business model moderated by clever stakeholder engagement principles as being the kind of model of the 90s and the early parts of the millennium. But certainly I'm of the view that he's made a pretty fair attempt to create a framework which brings together the individual responsibilities and the personal development component of our contribution to the future and the organisational change and transformation which can be done at a more aggregated level once people have actually got the right core values and of course increasingly opportune the technology platforms that allow collaboration of like-minded people, whether they happen to be embedded in formal organisations and institutions or maybe just in communities on that global basis. So I'm certainly a fan of that joined up collaborative type framework that Sharma talks about in his book Theory U and latterly Leading from the Emerging Future. So I'm hoping that from my perspective as a change management specialist and with my esteemed colleagues here today, that we've given you some food for thought on how we might think about the bigger picture and maybe translate that into purposeful action both within organisations and our broader communities. Thank you.
Thank you.